Nau mai te whānau, nau mai ki tēnei wānanga. Nei re te mihi kia koutou. I'll quickly start with a karakia to open us all up, and then we'll go start our wānanga. Nei re te mihi kia koutou. Tiki nā tūrā ko te mauri o rangi, ko te mauri o papa, ko te mauri o tāne, te wānanga e. No whea te mauri, no runga no raro no roto no ahi, te mai te mauri, e nei puki a mo kura e. Nau mai ki tēnei wānanga. Ka rere aku mihi ki o koutou rā. Ki o koutou maunga, ki o koutou aua, ki o koutou kōiwi, ko moahui atu ingoa. He uri hau no kauwhata, no raukawa, no rere ahu. Neira aku mihi kia koutou. I have the privilege of chairing this session, this wānanga, this fireside chat today with my whanaunga. And so quickly we'll go through some tikanga for all of us, some tikanga haumaru for this wānanga, and then we'll go through a couple of housekeeping mea, and then we'll get into our wānanga. Just quickly share my screen. Koutou mā, our community code or our tikanga for today. We're curious, open and respectful. We make generous assumptions, pai tera, confidentiality, one person, one mic. We speak from our own experience. No one knows everything. We know a lot together. We'll make space and make time, particularly for pātai during this wānanga. And we can't be articulate all the time, and we don't take ourselves too seriously. So, anei ngā tikanga for this wānanga. The next slide. Here is some accessibility info for whānau. So if you would like live captions, haere ki www.caseviewnet.com with the session code, and you'll be able to have live captions across your screen. So for those of our whānau who need this or would like this, feel free to connect. Anei he mihi ki o koutou rā, ngā partners and our supporters. And just a shout out, there's Kei Te Mura Otiahi, a marathon for racial justice, which is on Friday the 22nd of March and starts at 8:30 a.m. So there's a couple of housekeeping, bit of housekeeping for all of us as we go through this wānanga. So we do have Baruch and Rochelle who are helping us moderate and with our IT system, and they will be in the background. This kōrero we're going to have it as a fireside chat or a wānanga between the whanaunga and I, and hopefully yourself. So if you have any burning pātai, please put them in the Q&A or the chat, and Rochelle will go through with them and bring them to us during the conversation. So we are looking at having this be as interactive as possible. And so I might bring Kazi Meihano on, who will introduce himself and kōrero and give an overall context about what we're talking about. And then we'll do a fireside chat, wānanga approach, and have your questions come through at the same time. And then we'll close off and do a bit of a wrap up. So tēnā koe whanaunga, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei wānanga. I'll hand over the rākau over to you.
Kia ora e te whanaunga, moahuia o tira, koto katoa ko whakapiripiri mai ki tēnei kaupapa nei, o tira tēnei tonu au te mihira, ki te hunga whakarite i tā tātou hui, a ipurangi nei, e kore pau ngā mihi, hera kia koto katoa, o tira, kei ngā tangata tiriti, kei ngā tangata whenua o te motu whānui, puta noa i Aotearoa me te Waiponamu, tēnā koutou. O tira he uri tēnei no Ngāti Kauwhata Rangitāne i te taho tō mātou papa. Taitona watu ki te iwi o Ngāti Porou, rongo whakaate me kaitahu te taho tō mātou kōka, ko meihana turi tēnei e mihi atu nei ki a koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Back to you, te whanaunga. Kia ora.
Kia ora tā. The whanaunga, we are in an extraordinary time, a wā, which is certainly changed all of our views, our whakaaro, possibly our priorities. And we would love to get your whakaaro about, particularly give an overview of the context and what's the real issues. So what's the knuckle, what are the things that you can identify in this particular wā, and maybe with some context of titiro ki muri as well. Kia koe.
Kia ora, Moahuia. I think that's a really neat way to start the kōrero, and it is going to be a kōrero too, you know, I think in terms of us just surfacing things which are current, but the kaupapa of this wahanga for us is te tiro whakamuri kia kite ai a mua. So we know that in order to be informed about what the future might look like, we have to dig deep into our past in order to understand what our tupuna encountered and what our grandparents and parents encountered and what we are now encountering, to strategize and to figure out how we keep moving forward and how we navigate the space, and all things that are relevant to Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So I think that's a really good place to start this discussion. And, you know, it would really be remiss of me to not tend to the biggest issue of the moment, which is the incredible tension that has been imposed upon us as Māori, but imposed upon us as a nation, Aotearoa, by the fact that we now have a government who are fundamentally opposed to some of the tenets of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And in particular, I think the notion of partnership, whereby in the past, if we look to the past and we look to successive governance, irrespective of where one might stand on the political spectrum, successive governments have always known that there's a lot to be said about good partnership between the Crown and between Māori, but particularly when it comes to honouring Te Tiriti. And, you know, we know that Te Tiriti has not been honoured as good as it could have been in the past, and that's probably why we're here today. However, I think the general anxiety, if I could put it that way, across the motu right now is that we have a government who are intentionally undermining all of the good work that our tupuna and our kaumātua and our rangatira have contributed to Aotearoa over the years, and that's incredibly worrying for me. And if we just take Te Ako Whaiora as the first example, what the media don't say is that Te Ako Whaiora came off the back of 4, if not 5 decades of battling, fighting for greater tino rangatiratanga by Māori, for Māori health. That wasn't a kaupapa which just popped up prior to the previous government announcing that Te Ako Whaiora was going to come into being. That move towards Te Ako Whaiora had been something which was championed right from about the mid-70s all the way through to a couple of years ago. So, you know, it's a mistake to believe that Te Ako Whaiora is a recent kaupapa. It may not be perfect, but it comes off the back of successive decades of our kaumātua, you know, our kuia karaua championing for Māori to take greater tino, for us to have greater tino rangatiratanga of our health, and for us to be in a position where we can determine outcomes for our health. So that's incredibly worrying. The other thing that the media won't tell us, of course, is the level of energy that our people have put into this kaupapa, all of the karakia, all of the pōwhiri, all of the whakawairia that went into ensuring that our Māori health professionals and our Māori health organisations could be safe and could do their work to the best of their ability. Those are the things that we don't hear about in the media, of course. And we are now entirely dependent on the whim of the present government to figure out how we as Māori ensure that we don't die early. Because if we look at the repeal of the smoke-free bill, all of the evidence tells us that we're still going to die 7 years earlier than non-Māori, right? And not only that, because of the repeal of the smoke-free bill, there is a much greater likelihood that Māori are going to die from lung cancer at a much higher rate of prevalence than what has been the trend in the last few years. So those things are worrying for me, Moahuia, and I think they're worrying for all New Zealanders who identify as tangata whenua and tangata tiriti. What's in the best interest of Māori is in the best interest of our nation. So I give you that example as but one. of several decisions that and policies and repeals and 100-day plan action points that have been actioned now that are going to have a severely negative impact upon Māori.
Tika tau whanaunga, tika tau whanaunga. I absolutely agree with that sentiment. I think the dissolution of Te Ako Whaiora is probably is a very consequential example of anti-Māori or anti-tino rangatiratanga and health positions. So yeah, and also, can I just ask Whanaunga your thoughts in regards to Te Ako Whaiora and health? So it's been disestablished, and we have whanaunga and whānau in Te Ako Whaiora and numerous whānau on this wānanga who are part of Te Ako Whaiora and fighting for Te Ako Whaiora. Where to from here? What are your thoughts? Do you have any whakaaro about what we can do in the next 6 months in relation to Te Ako Whaiora?
Pai tō pātai, mua hui he rawe tō pātai. I think first and foremost, we should be using collective impact as the vehicle to get us to where we're going to have to be, not only in the next 6 months, but I think over the next 3 years, that there's no other way that we as Māori can protect our right to good health if we don't think about how we can, really activate this thing known as collective impact. May the 31st, I think Ngāti Kahungunu are going to be hosting the next Hui a Motu at Omahu Marae, and I mihi to our whanaunga of Ngāti Kahungunu because it's a massive undertaking. However, that hui is going to be particularly important for Māori. What we know, of course, is under the mana of Kingi Tuheitia activating Te Paki o Matariki earlier this year, Māori, tangata whenua and tangata tiriti came together en masse. There were over 10,000 people at Tūranga Waiwai. That was really the beginning of the discussion about what kind of leadership model are we going to need in order to, ensure that our rights under Te Tiriti o Waitangi are protected. And secondly, to ensure that the lives and livelihoods of Māori are protected moving forward, particularly over the next few years. So that conversation, and once again, I'd mihi to Ratana, to our whanaunga out there, and also to all of, our tangata whenua up at Waitangi. Those 3 hui were hugely impactful. And for those who attended all 3 hui, you would have seen that there was a layering of kōrero that began to emerge over time, and there were consistent themes all the way through. I mean, if we just sort of pick up Hone Harawira's kōrero at Waitangi, Hone talked about the fact that this isn't good enough, that why should we as Māori allow and stand by and see a government just dismantling the work of all of these champions of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and people who have advanced our kaupapa? Why should we stand by and allow that to happen? So I thought Hone posed a very, very good question. And I think Annette Sykes also posed some very thoughtful questions at Tūranga Waiwai. What we need to do now is think about what Omahu is going to look like in terms of the framework for leadership. Because of course we know that this really isn't just a question about how do our iwi chairs work together. We have the iwi chairs forum, we have the Māori Women's Welfare League, we have the National Māori Council, but we also have a huge range of other organisations and kaupapa that are representative of us and our diversity actually as Māori. I would think about things like the Kohanga Reo National Trust, Te Runanga Nui o ngā Kura Kaupapa Māori, Kura Aiwi. Whatever that leadership vehicle looks like moving forward, it has to account for the sheer diversity of Māori. If we think as well, 1 in 4 Māori live in Auckland, right? And so we have to account for urban Māori authorities. We have to ensure that those of our whānau living in cities are duly represented. So those are important considerations. It's been, I think, with 1984, almost to the day the Hui Taumata was held at Hui Whakaoranga at Hoani Waititi Marae. I think it's this week coming 40 years. So when we track back to 1984 and we think about all of the hard work that was achieved in 1984, and we fast forward to 2024, I think for me the real risk, Moahuia, is that we are at a precipice where either all of that good work will continue to be undone, or we make a stand. And to do that, though, I think we really do need to have our tangata tiriti allies with us to move forward.
Totally agree. Totally agree. I was at a wānanga about exactly this. What does Māori leadership look like in this wā? Because we have in this particular coalition government looks and feels different, and their drivers are different from possibly previous governments. Their drivers are different, so we have a range of evidence and robust evidence and international evidence, for example, around Te Ako Whai Ora, and that is being absolutely dismissed and ignored. So what are the drivers? What other drivers do we need for this particular government? And in our wānanga, we talked about Mātauranga Māori and how we have always been strategic in the way that we, ngā kupunga and how we fished an ETC. So we need different people, different organisations to do different things, slow more approach, and a framework, in a leadership, in a tino rangatira framework of leadership, but using our strengths and every leverage and every conversation in every place possible. And tangata tiriti allyship, I would think, like you said, is absolutely important and crucial. In regards to the tangata tiriti dimension for 2024, is there any specific examples or anything that you can that you have in your head around how they could activate or mobilise? I know that there's numerous things already happening, and kia ora, Heather's put a whole lot of things in the chat, but do you have any other tips or any other kind of mobilisation strategies possibly for our tangata tiriti whānau?
I think to a degree, our tangata tiriti allies are already mobilising right now. I mean, for those of us who are at Tūranga Waiwai, the sheer numbers of tangata tiriti allies who were there was quite incredible. And I think that's a really authentic reflection of the change in Aotearoa society in the last 40 years. I mean, if we track back to 1984 and figure out, what those progressions have been, that's been a major development for us as Te Tiriti education has, taken hold across various teaching and learning sites throughout Aotearoa. The real impact of Te Tiriti education is it reminds us of our responsibilities and obligations, both as tangata tiriti and tangata whenua. So I think in terms of the mobilisation question, our tangata tiriti allies are there. And I only have to go back as far as, 2 years ago to our hikoi for Ngāti Kaupata and for Te Raurau and the Waira Manawa Tūrohe, when we were, taking up a stand against the local council's decision to rescind the Māori wards. And in the end, we came out on top in terms of the ward being restored to Manawatu. But that was a good example of the fact that there are allies out there who understand that we as Māori, we can't hikoi down this path on our own. We have to have people with us. But the other thing I would say is if we look across to other contexts, and I'm just going to use education right now, as recently as last week, we saw a very unfortunate situation of young Māori rangatahi taiahui having to haka to protest and to signal their dismay at the fact that a minister had come into their space of learning, which is supposed to be a safe space. The school is supposed to be a place where tangata whenua can thrive and flourish, right? And, I question the idea of having somebody who is very much about dismantling the good work of our people walking into a school. How confronting is that for our taiahi to have to not only acknowledge that there's someone in the school who is opposed to the rights of Māori under Te Tiriti o Waitangi, but equally they and other parties in the coalition government right now are opposed to the place and the status of Te Reo Māori. What message does it send to taiahi in our high schools and mainstream schooling systems, when they are taught that, being proud to be Māori is a good thing, accessing te reo Māori is a good thing, and someone comes along and puts them into a place of apprehension and fear. I question that, because I think what we're seeing is a situation that's rapidly unfolding where places like schools, which are supposed to be safe places, right, for our young people, are no longer safe. And so that type of situation should never, ever have happened. And, I see that the school is now reprimanding those students for doing the haka. Our haka, when we do it, it's our way of protecting our mana. We do a haka because we protect our mana. We look after our tuakana and teina. We look after the mana of our people. That's why we haka. And, if I track back to last week with the Paua haka, Hurricanes Paua, what right does someone who is not wahine have to critique a haka wahine? Those are the questions that the media need to be asking. We've had enough airtime from the politicians who are not experts in tikanga Māori. They're not experts in haka, yet somehow they've been given the microphone to commentate on whether or not the haka of a kapa wahine is appropriate or inappropriate. It's not their place to do that. Haka is a vehicle for Māori to affirm our mana motu hake and to talk about the issues of the day. That's why we do haka. And, I haven't heard a question around why do the All Blacks still do tingiri a te rauparaha? Nobody's questioned that, but that's a very topical haka. It's political. So there has to be, I think there has to be sort of an equivalence when the media are addressing these issues. That doesn't really answer your question, Moahuia, but I did want to just remind our viewers today that the voice of our rangatahi is an incredibly powerful voice. So we've talked a bit about the place of tangata tiriti, but the other thing I would say is that in the past probably 2 decades, and I would say that actually through the establishment of Kura Kaupapa Māori off the back of the Kohanga Reo movement, Kura Aiwi, Kura a Hapu, the voice of our rangatahi has become amplified. So that leadership model that you're talking about, it needs to also account for the criticality of the voices of our young people.
Kia ora, gorgeous. Yeah, absolutely. And I pretended I was a rangatahi and set myself in the wānanga at the Kini Tangahui. Probably got into trouble for that. But anyway, they were gorgeous. They were stunning. They were talking about how their mana motuhake doesn't belong in Wellington. It belongs with them. And so they were also talking about how they the daily practice of mana motuhake and what that looks like for them. And sticking really close to that. What does mana motuhake look like for them, for their whānau, for their hapu, for their iwi, and as well as interrogating the Crown practices, but making sure that they were really, really well, I suppose, aligned to what the mana motuhake is. So that's a really good segue, Kaz, into a pātai that I got from someone else for you specifically, is this time is uncertain and turbulent. What are some ways that we can practice our own mana motuhake and keep ourselves well during this time? Ahine ngaro a wairua. So yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Me hoki au ki ngā kōrero mo te whare tapawhā tō mātou matua, nāna tērā whare whakatū. Engari, i te wai whakatū te whare tapawhā, i reira katoa no hoki ngā toa o te hauara Māori. So, I'd probably take it back to the whare tapawhā that when we think about those 4 dimensions of wairua, tinana, hinengaro, and whānau, it's not about us doing a cross between all of those. So we don't break those into 4 areas. That the really important thing about whare tapawhā is understanding that impacts upon whanaungatanga will also impact upon hinengarotanga, our mental well-being. Impacts upon mental well-being will also impact upon taha tinana, our physical well-being, and impacts on taha tinana, of course, will also impact upon taha wairua. I've had some very interesting kōrero recently at Te Whanaunga about what constitutes wairuatanga. The really important part in that discussion is to say to people that wairuatanga are the things that keep you well. They're the practices, the routines, the habits, the go-to places, the things that we do to ensure that our sense of spirituality is activated. So once those things stop, right, there's an impact on taha hinengaro. There's a flow and impact upon taha wairu and so on. And so the four energies are actually interacting in the same whare. You are the whare, we are the whare. So I think that's an important thing to remember. But also, if I bring it back to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, Te Tiriti guarantees us as Māori our rights. And that comes off the back of he whakaputanga. And I'm not sure if people have spoken too much about he whakaputanga today, but for those who attended Waitangi, of course, koina te matua, or Te Tiriti o Waitangi. It's hard to talk about Te Tiriti o Waitangi without referencing he whakaputanga, because that really was the starting point about the affirmation and the reaffirmation really of mana motuhake. And let's just, I guess, thread the notion of haputanga into that, because one of the things we know, of course, through Te Tiriti o Waitangi settlements and claims and so on, is that it was easier for the Crown to ask iwi to group together, right? And so an iwi, of course, is a collection of hapu who come together for particular kaupapa, such as warfare, such as environmental disasters, such as kaupapa of the day. But the signatories of Te Tiriti, of course, were leaders in rangatira wahine, rangatira tāne of hapu. So within this broader discussion, it's very, very important to think about what constitutes haputanga in 2024. Now, what we see, of course, is that over the years, some hapu change their identity, right? They become part of a wider collective, and they forgo their name, and they become part of that kaupapa and that under the mana of a particular tupuna. But we see the evolution, I think, of hapu right now, where you have a number of whānau in a community who have intermarried over 4 or 5 decades. If I just use West Auckland as one example, Te Whānau Waipareira. What we see really is the evolution of new communities that are dependent upon the same education, the same employment, the same health, the same economy. And that's really what a hapu is. So we shouldn't, I guess, minimize the discussion of what a hapu represents in relation to honouring Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
So we do have a pātai from the floor whanaunga, flax roots activity. What are your thoughts on flax roots activity outside of the examples that you've already given? Are there any other flax roots activities that you can think of?
Te pāhara keke ne, he rawe tera pātai. Flax roots, it reminds us of that really prominent concept of te pāhara keke, looking after our whānau first and foremost. Hutia te rito te harakeke kei whia te kōmako e ko mako e kia atu he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. So those are all whakatauki which remind us about our collective responsibilities to our whānau, to our communities. So the first thing is, I think, make sure our communities, our hapori, are safe and well. Make sure that the expression of tino rangatiratanga and mana motuhake isn't in any way, shape or form negatively impacted upon by the policies of the day. We know that over time, politics have not necessarily been kind to Māori, but we also know that we have some incredible champions and leaders across our communities who can lead communities. So I think that's the first thing. And it's very, very important to ensure that within this kind of environment of quite dark negativity, that we also think about what constitutes flourishing. Flourishing for our people is about Māori having decisions about their education. Not all of our people will go down a particular pathway, but if we have the principle of options in front of us, our people then get to determine the best pathway for their tamariki mokopuna. So that's incredibly important. We know that the education system over the last 200 years has not been designed to empower Māori to succeed. And that's why we have our own forms and systems of education, but we also have to ensure we've got options. The other thing I think too is that we need to kind of revisit, I think, the ability to identify what I would call iho pumanawa or pitomata. Those are the gifts and talents that our people have inherited from their tupuna and from their kaumātua. And too often the education system doesn't enable the revelation of particular gifts and talents to be not only identified, but nurtured and nourished. And that's probably why we have kohanga reo and kura kaupapa to an extent. So we have to be very good at identifying the talents of our people while they're young. And then we have to be able to ensure that whatever we do in terms of the curriculum that we put around our tamariki mokopuna, that we can empower them to use those gifts and talents that they have inherited. So that's what Māori education is all about. That's what good education is about, that we acknowledge the whakapapa and the iho pumanawa that has come to our tamariki mokopuna, and collectively as a community, we nurture and nourish those gifts so that they're not wasted. And when we do that well, we have a diverse community. We understand too, and I think a lot about Eritana Tawhiwherangi's kōrero, that part of our mahi in our life is to empower our young people and to ensure that they can take up the responsibilities in alignment with their iho pumanawa, you know, and their pitomata, their potential.
Yeah, how do we? Yeah, really love that kōrero about fostering and flourishing our pūkina. Rawetira. We have another kātai whanaunga. You spoke about the Māori ward situation in Manawatu. There's been a significant growth in Māori representation in local government across the country because of Māori wards. He pātai, what are your views regarding educating marae, hapu and iwi on the mechanics of local government to enhance better fertility-based outcomes for Māori?
It's a great question. I just want to reword the question so that the question would be, how do we ensure that local councils can be educated about the place and sovereignty of Māori? A hapu, a iwi, a hapori. So our experience locally and where we're from, of course, Te Whanaunga, is that there's still a lot of education that needs to be done in terms of informing and enabling councils to fulfill their responsibilities and obligations for Māori. One thing which I think we're all very, very anxious about right now is that there is a clause right now which would potentially enable a referendum to occur, which would then mean that we don't necessarily have any security around Māori wards continuing. That's a very, very concerning situation because of all of the work, particularly I think under Minister Nanaia Mahuta in her time, to ensure that the referendum clause could be taken out so that actually councils and communities could be self-determining about having a Māori ward. So that's one part of it. I think too, it's a very good question because the other part of the answer is that our rangatahi need to know and understand the functions of local government, of local councils. When we had our issues a few years ago in the Manawatu, what we found out through our rangatahi was that they wanted to be a part of that. They wanted to be knowledgeable and understanding of what the function of a council is, but they didn't know. So, the answer is that we have to be able to ensure that our young people know what local government is and what the function of a local council is, but they also need to know what happens in the government itself, the governments of the day. Politics is an incredibly important part of understanding how we utilize politics to gain advances and good outcomes for our people.
Really liked how you flipped that in regards to educating the council. Pai tērā. He pātai anō, never waste a good crisis. What are the positives of this crisis? What can we find that are positives of this wā making?
Kia ora, tino pai tēnā pātai. I think it's really good to still come back to the positives, because there have been and there continue to be a number of empowering things that are happening right now. If we think about the current political climate and the fact that Te Tiriti o Waitangi as the founding covenant of this nation has been under threat and remains under threat. Let's not kind of erase that entirely, that, you know, that potential for Te Tiriti to be severely undermined. The good things that are coming out of this right now is that we're beginning to see an increasing number of New Zealanders who understand their roles and responsibilities as tangata tiriti. That's phenomenal. And whilst there's a lot of pressure upon us as Māori right now, you know, I think in terms of solidarity, we can see that we are well supported by a growing number of people who understand what it means to be tangata tiriti in Aotearoa. That's probably the first thing. The second thing is that what we're seeing is that Māori, both in terms of various organisations, hapu, iwi, community leaders and community groups, are putting aside some of the differences of the day for the bigger issue of the day, which is that there is an inherent threat that sits upon our, you know, our right to exercise mana motuhake and tino rangatiratanga. And so what's happening right now is we're seeing this very, very strong voice of kotahitanga that's pulling us together, because we can only really advance and deflect these ongoing pressures and challenges from the government of the day if we do this as, you know, as a kotahitanga informed kaupapa, to do it together as a collective thing, rather than us doing this individually as hapu or iwi. We're not going to be able to do that unless we are very, very collectivized. And so I think those are the real benefits that are coming out now. The last one I would say, though, is that I think our rangatahi are beginning to understand the importance of knowing about politics, right? And knowing about our tiriti and he whakaputanga, and also our rights under Te Tiriti o Waitangi. My sense is that the understanding and knowledge of our young people has advanced so much across the past decade. And that's probably one thing that's the results of what we're seeing playing out right now in Aotearoa.
Right. Okay. Really do agree about the you know, the positives of kotahitanga. And like you and I were at that Kingitanga Hui and at Waitangi, it was phenomenal. It was phenomenal. And outside of the tense situation with the politicians and the, you know, and the Prime Minister etc. Was an experience of mana motuhake, because particularly at Kingitanga and Waitangi, there was rongowa because everyone was speaking reo, and there was children playing, and it was a fun time as well. So I think that equilibrium between we've got to do the politics stuff, but also let's be Māori and do our whanaungatanga and the things that are important to us. I think that's fabulous. There is a kōrero that comes up quite consistently, and it's come up again in the chat around, it's a little challenging to hear this particular very conservative government that has come in. Numerous of those key players are ours. He Māori rātou. Nō reira, he aho tō whakaro I pāna ki tērā. Yeah. Well, he wānanga kei te haere, he wānanga tērā, ingarira, he nunui ake tērā pātai. When we talk about an extremely conservative government and numerous policies that are trying to dismantle tino rangatiratanga, and numerous of those key players, he Māori rātou. So he aho o whakaro. That might be another wānanga whānau, that might be a 4-day wānanga by ourselves. But that has come up, so.
Tika tonu.
Hea koe te rākau.
He tino wānanga tērā, engari me mihi tuatahi ki ngā mea Māori ke roto I te whare paremata e whawhai ana mo te tino rangatiratanga mo te mana motuhake o te iwi Māori. E mihi kaua tuanau ki tērā hunga kei roto I te whare paremata e whakapau kaha ana ki te manaaki te mana Māori. So firstly, I just want to acknowledge those of our people who are in Parliament, who are doing the hard work to protect our sovereign rights under Te Tiriti o Waitangi. We're incredibly fortunate that we have Māori in Parliament who understand what it means to be Māori. That's probably the answer to your question. They understand that our values include tika and pono, to act in ways that are consistent with our tikanga, and not only that, to act in ways that are consistent with the expectations of our kaumātua and our tupuna. When you act in ways that are consistent with what our old people would have wanted or aspired to, you can't go wrong. So I firstly just want to acknowledge and mihi to those of our people, and some of them are no longer in Parliament. I'll add that in there too. Some of our people have come out and they've fought the good fight. And now we have, another generation of Māori in there who are fighting those battles on our behalf. My point would be that they can't do it on their own. We're at the whim of a political system we know to be democracy. And democracy, I'm afraid, doesn't always serve the best interests of Indigenous peoples, and Māori in particular, in the way that it promises to. And therefore, we find ourselves in a situation now where we have a new government. The majority of voters have voted in the new coalition government, and now we have to put up with what we're seeing, and we have to try and fight back. So first of all, I think it's really important to acknowledge the work of our people who are going into mahi every day, into Te Whare Paremata, on behalf of their constituents and on behalf of our people to fight the good fight. But second of all, I think the question that Māori politicians who are part of the coalition government need to answer is, he aha te nei mea kia nei ko te kaupapa Māori. What does kaupapa Māori and being Māori mean to them? Because what I see, and from the outside looking in, is I see a government that's led in part by Māori who are in the government right now, who are wholly intentional about dismantling all of the good work that our people have put into place over the years. And I won't name anyone, but what I would say is this, is that when you go into those places, it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be elected into Parliament. It's a privilege to be an MP. And, people shouldn't forget the fact that, our people are very, very good at remembering what happens. We're historians as Māori. We know our whakapapa, we know our history. And we also know the times in our history that haven't served us well. This is one of those times, but I think we also need to remember that we can't rely on our politicians, particularly those in the opposition, to do the hard yards for us. We actually have to be doing things as tangata whenua, as tangata tiriti, to ensure that it's not all sitting on the shoulders of a small number of people.
We're coming up to 4:45, so I'm just checking in if there's any other questions that have come through. Otherwise, we might look at wrapping it up. I have my own question, Whananga. We have numerous Māori public servants and Māori MPs, Māori public servants and Māori MPs that are feeling pushed and pulled, feeling uncertain, feeling angry, etc., and needing a whole lot of support themselves. Wairua support, Māori support, etc., in order to find a way to navigate through this. And that's from health, education, etc., and in order to navigate their way through this. I think there is an opportunity maybe for us in our leadership models to have a wānanga about how we look after ahu, or how we look after the wairua of our whānau and our Māori public servants and our tangata tiriti public servants, and provide ahurutanga for them while they're in a system that is absolutely designed not for us, but to be against us. But they're also well aware, and there's numerous whakaaro and diverse realities about this, but they're also well, if they're not at the table, then that table is going to look a hell of a lot different if they're not there. So there's this real tension, and yeah, I've had numerous public servants, Māori and Pākehā, reach out because they need support, and the system, the structural system around them provides no support to navigate this kind of wā. Do you have any whakaaro about that, or is there anything that, are there any mechanisms that you know of that we can provide? Our wairua, our pure, whatever that looks like for all of us, including our Māori public servants.
He tito pātai tērā, me taku mihi hoki ki te hunga, e mahi atu ana I roto I ngā tari o te kāwanatanga ngā mea Māori ke reira tēnei kamihi ake, kia autonu, kia mautonu me pērā te kōrero. So, just to reaffirm that, those pieces of work that our people are doing in those spaces are incredibly important. But I think the question actually probably aligns to the discussion we had earlier in this conversation, which is about what type of model can we as Māori construct that lessens our dependence upon the economy of the government and Crown-led initiatives? What kind of, Indigenous model can we conceptualize that enables us to move away from financial dependence on government structures? Now, I put that question out there because what we're talking about as well is this now an opportunity for us to connect more closely with other Indigenous nations across the world? And when we start to talk about joint ventures, and when we start to talk about media models, right, we understand that right now in Aotearoa, there's huge pressure on what I would call the traditional media formats, the television stations who are now under huge pressure, and I worry about what that implies for Māori media. Part of that answer, I think, is in terms of us opening that wānanga up to our Indigenous brothers and sisters around the world to see, is this the time where we can really look seriously at an Indigenous economy that enables us to lessen our dependence upon both employment in areas like public service, but also increases our level of independence to be able to be more self-determining. And, tūranga waiwai, and this might be a good place to finish up, e te whanaunga. On our panel, Tākiri Tū Te Ora, we were talking about Indigenous health models. And 1922, Te Puia Herangi brought forward the proposition about establishing the first Māori hospital at Tūranga Waiwai under the context of Mahinarangi. Now, that idea was so radical in 1922 that the government of the day said, how could we possibly establish a Māori hospital? It wasn't just about a hospital. Te Puia, she envisaged the complementary nature of Western medicine and rongoa. So, the ideas are already there. Our tupuna, amazing. They have already conceptualized these things. But if we can lessen our dependence upon these structures of authority that come from the Crown, if we can think about what indigeneity looks like when we have joint ventures, when we're working more closely together with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, and even doing it here in Aotearoa as iwi, as hapu, as communities, I think in some ways there's something in that space. We haven't quite explored it to its fullest potential, but we probably need to now. And I think that potential is huge. There's an opportunity there for us to think really, openly about how we change the system by building our own system. We've already seen that through, I guess, initiatives and movements like Kohanga Reo, Kura Kaupapa Māori, Kura Iwi. So we can do it. It just needs a coalition of the willing.
Arawe constitutional. Kia ora, kia ora. I do have one more question. We do have time for one more question. There are numerous questions in the chat and the Q&A, but we'll have one more, and then whānau, for all the other pātai that are outstanding, Matua Meihana will provide some answers back to you. But the one that has come up a bit is, as tangata tiriti, how can I support more? Is there a place to go? Is there a place that I can support? Is there any he whakaaro tau?
Kia ora. Ai, he whakaaro oku, e hangai ana pēr ki etahi atu o ngā kōrero kua horahia I te rangi nei. Just reflecting on some of the messages that Leonie was sharing today and some of our other speakers earlier on, my whakaaro are absolutely in alignment with what, you know, almost all of our speakers have shared today, that for Tangata Tiriti, I think, first of all, understanding that Te Tiriti was a document for the future. It was about thinking about what the future is going to look like for us, tangata whenua, tangata tiriti, and not losing hope that there is promise and potential ahead of us if we honour Te Tiriti o Waitangi in the way that our tupuna imagined it would be honoured. And when I say our tupuna, I'm talking about the signatories of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. I'm seeing some really good kōrero popping up from Maria Baker and Heather as well, talking about Matike Mai. Phenomenal. So Matike Mai, and if I just, perhaps as a closing comment, e te whanaunga, just reflect on the work that Matua Moana Jackson did, you know, and if people want to get a quick grasp on what can Tangata Tiriti do, I would really encourage people to read some of Moana's work, to read his writings, but also to watch some of those clips that are still out there on YouTube where he's able to articulate the issues of the day very, very clearly and concisely. And those articulations from Matua Moana, I think, are very, very useful because it reminds us of our responsibilities both as tangata tiriti and tangata whenua.
Oh, ka pai whanaunga. I think that's probably the best way to wrap up with Matua's readings and his resources that are available to our whānau. So whānau, Heather has put in the chat the Matike Mai report. And so you can click straight through to there. So whānau, I know we've had this fireside wānanga that we've been everywhere. We've been to health, we've been to education, we've been from rangatahi to flax roots, back up to iwi, hapu, right through to tiriti whakaputanga, wairuatanga and keeping ourselves well, being a public servant and the tensions of doing that through to local wards. I think we've canvassed pretty much every point on the coalition agreement.
Yeah.
E te whanaunga. Just before we do our acknowledgements, is there any last minute, last whakaaro?
Yeah, look, there's never a dull moment right now. And for those of you who have, made the awesome decision to tune into the entirety of this hui online, well done to all of you, because that's what it's going to take. We need people to be well informed in order to be able to help support the most impactful decisions for us as Māori, as tangata whenua, as tangata tiriti. And we can only do that through kaupapa and conversations like these. Everyone has their own view, and I've seen so many pieces of chat coming up and kōrero and questions. That's what it's going to take, and we should never sit still. Me kaua e mutu takiwa noiho nei, tā tātou kōkiri te kaupapa. We shouldn't be stagnant in our work, but it takes a community, it takes the voices of all people to ensure that we can keep moving forward. Nō reira, tēnei taku mihi kia koutou katoa.
Well, needed to mihi te whanaunga, and for everyone online, kari arikirikinga mihi kia koutou. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for all the whakaaro rangatira in the chat. This will be on YouTube in about 2 weeks, so you can review everything we said. Review everything we said. E te whanaunga mau I whakakapi mo te karakia mutinga, pai tira mau?
Pai ana.
Or hand back to the whanaunga.
Pai te pai. A ka tira a te huanga o te whakaaro nui he pua ki tanga mātou rangatuia ki te ira tangata tāwhiwhi atu ki te kāhunga atua. Ko horahia te takapau wharanui te rerengo te kōrero ki te ao marama. Marama ki uta, marama ki tai. Tahia te ki, tahia te wānanga. Hoatu e rongo. Whakairi hea ki te kōrero ki ringa. Ki tō tātou nei whare, te kupu kōrero kia mau, ki te wānanga kiau. Oi o whiwhia, oi o rawea tūrau, parea tūrau Hawaiki. E rarau ki te tapu e nui o tāne. Tāne I te wānanga, tāne nui ārangi. Turu ofi te whakamaua kia tīnā. Tīnā haumi e, hui e. Tae ki e. Kia ora tātou.
Tēnā koutou.